Welcome to another video in our Ancient Egypt series. This time around we're going to be looking at ancient Egyptian society and daily life. So last time we were together we looked at the Nile, the features of the Nile and what kind of society it spawned. Basically one centered around farming the floodplains of the Nile, raising a whole bunch of staple crops and livestock. Today you're going to find out a little bit more about what that actually looked like and what it evolved into. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at the big picture. That means an eye in the sky view, not looking at the person or the family or the town, but looking at the entirety of Egyptian society and coming to some conclusions about it. So to start off with, you might be thinking that the ancient Egyptians lived in places like this mainly. Depending on how much you know about ancient Egypt, you've probably heard about the pyramids and you might think they existed in cities like this. So this is Heliopolis, one of the big cities of ancient Egypt, one that was very important, had different temples, thousands and thousands of people. But the truth of the matter is the vast majority of ancient Egyptians lived in abodes more like this. Now this is a depiction of a basic ancient Egyptian village. The one that you can already tell is next to the Nile. You've got the stream, the rivulet coming out of the Nile there, providing some drinking water and place to wash clothing. You've got the vast majority of the population living in small huts, usually made of mud brick, dried mud brick, and sometimes painted mud brick. And of course, you've got those staple crops in the background, which tells you that the people there, by and large, are farmers. And we're going to look at this in numbers. We're going to look at the different aspects of Egyptian society, starting with big picture numbers. So, what are we talking about? What was Egyptian society made up of? Who was actually a member of Egyptian society? Well, at the very top, the 1%, you've got the ruling class. That's the pharaoh, who we'll talk about more soon, as well as the royal family, as well as the nobility of Egypt, meaning people related to the royal family. And of course the viziers, the nomarchs, the people who helped the pharaoh rule Egypt. Then you have about 5% of the population who were soldiers, scribes, and priests, which means people who fight, people who can write things down, and people who pray and organize prayer. And they were all pretty equally important. They basically made Egypt what it was. The soldiers did the conquering. The scribes, they had to record important information on papyrus and in hieroglyphs to help, for example, the pharaoh understand exactly what he was governing or how many people he had in his kingdom or what kind of taxes were coming in, how much property they had. Priests, of course, looked after religious life of Egypt. And then you got another 5% or so who were craftsmen or merchants, so people who made things, who built things, the people who produced the jewelry, who produced the pottery, all the stuff that people had in their homes, and all the stuff they used as weapons, etc. And then you have the 90%, the vast majority of people who were farmers, who did nothing all year but farm and do construction in the 6 months where there was no farming to do. They tilled the soil. They used the inundation, the flooding of the Nile, to irrigate their fields. And they lived pretty short and brutal lives, as we'll see. But 90%, 9 out of every 10 people were farmers. And this is sort of what that big picture looks like. Although, as you can see, a very tiny percentage is part of the ruling class. And here in this pyramid, you've got to represent it as something that looks much bigger than it is. Okay, let's move on. So, we're talking about a group of people of which very few could read and write. Of that 100%, 95% could not read and write. You guys might take it for granted that you can read and write and add and subtract and multiply, hopefully. But very few Egyptians could. Those were the scribes whose job it was to do so. No school, no place to get educated, no place to improve yourself. The vast majority of people didn't have any formal education. And most of those people worked in the same occupation or job as their father before them. So if you were a farmer, it's probable that your father was a farmer too, and his father, and so on before him. This was a society that owned slaves, meaning you could, in it, own another person as property. it was fairly common, and a fairly large number of people were slaves, probably anywhere between 15 and 20% of the population. Religion was very important to the ancient Egyptians, who had lots of different gods, and we'll talk much more about that later when we talk about Egyptian beliefs. Family life, incredibly important. Family was the most important unit of organization. And the average life expectancy of ancient Egyptians was only about 30. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Short, brutal lives, and also the fact that about 50% of all children under the age of 10 died before their time due to disease mainly. So the family, which was the most important unit of social organization, consisted of the nuclear family as well as the extended family. So nuclear family is parents plus children, and then you get the extended family with grandparents and cousins, etc. In this family, men and women were really equal. So both had very similar rights. Men weren't more important and women weren't less important than men, as was the case in many ancient societies. So they could both, for example, inherit property equally. Both had the right to divorce if things weren't going well. And in addition to that, both male and female children were valued equally also. So in some ancient societies, male children were valued more because they could inherit, and male children were seen as more important for that reason. In Egypt, both were viewed equally. And often you did have extended families under the same roof. So, you might have the parents plus the grandparents plus the children of those parents in the same roof, under the same roof. So some of these abodes were pretty cramped. You'd have 15 people in a house built maybe for 4. Okay. So here we got just a representation of like an actual artifact from ancient Egypt representing a married couple, just to show you a little bit about what we mean by that equality. And you could see in that image, they were basically sculpted to be equal. Now, in terms of daily life, a lot of the stuff that the ancient Egyptians did in terms of their daily life, you guys would be fairly familiar with. For example, here we've got the snake game. They loved board games. They came up with some of the world's oldest board games. Here you've got a 20 square game, which is ancient. And here you've got an actual representation of an ancient Egyptian woman playing a board game. So all 3 of these are actual examples. They're photos of the real thing, either a drawing or the actual object in question. And finally, here we have an illustration of an ancient Egyptian woman throwing up after having a little bit too much to drink. So the ancient Egyptians in some ways are fairly familiar to us. They did similar sort of stuff to some of what we do, but they also led lives that were quite different in most cases. So those 90% of people, they spent their time tilling and working fields. This was brutal work. This was work that killed most of them around the age of 30, put them under the elements of the sun especially, and other brutal conditions that resulted in early deaths for many, many, many. Now, looking at the people at the very top and turning our attention to the pharaohs for a moment, we've got a group of people that essentially over time started off as just kings, right? Initially, when you're talking about Upper and Lower Egypt, you're just talking about kings. And hopefully we're broadly familiar with the idea of kings, people who rule countries by themselves. But very soon afterward, they became god kings. They became worshipped as gods. So essentially, they transformed their role from something that was mainly governing a place, ruling a place, to something that was religious as well. They built pyramids to house their mummies, so they would have their bodies mummified to be preserved for thousands of years, and those mummies were then placed in pyramids. And they competed. They would build bigger and bigger pyramids to show off just how important they were, or how much money they had, how wealthy their country was, essentially showing off. They had complete control of ancient Egypt, so no one else could contest their power. They were the ones in charge, and everybody knew it. And when they died, they passed on their position to their oldest son, usually. There were, like, for example, in the top right-hand corner, you've got Cleopatra. But female pharaohs were the exception rather than the rule. And that's essentially it. That's all we need to cover for this very broad, very basic look at ancient Egyptian society. We're talking about an advanced society, one that could build buildings like the ones you see in the bottom left-hand corner in the center, the pyramids, as well as a lot of other really impressive stuff. They knew how to do amazing things like, for example, preserve bodies. But the vast majority of ancient Egyptians were simple farmers who tilled the fields around the River Nile and lived short and brutal lives, but they knew how to inject some excitement into those lives, and they knew how to have fun. And there are some similarities that you guys can take stock of as you read into them and explore further. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening, and good luck with the rest of the week.